So, the last topic that we're going to deal with, the last big topic, and the last section ever that we're going to do together is the environment and environmentalism. But the first thing here I want you to do, you want to underline here Anthropocene and just real easy definition, just right above it. It's the current geological age. It's the current geological age. That'll just sort of kind of, solve any, issues that you might have as to what that definition was. So, the first thing we need to talk about, and some of this stuff we've already kind of sort of touched on in an earlier chapter, especially when we were dealing with some of the consequences and the fallout, like of the Industrial Revolution, is the global environment and how much that is transformed. And realistically, we have three factors that have magnified the human impact on the earth. One, the world has quadrupled in the 20th century. I mean, if you remember all the way back to the beginning of the year, remember, if we have more food, we have more people. If we have more people, we have more problems. And the environmental impact of those more people are going to be part of those more problems. We also have a massive use of fossil fuels, coal in the 19th century and oil in the 20th. And then on top of this, there's also enormous economic growth. Now, this, and you want to put down here next to C, you want to put down that this is growing industrialization, growing industrialization. And honestly, this enormous economic growth, as well as the massive use of fossil fuels, both of those are going to be linked to the growing industrialization that we're seeing globally. Now, here's the thing is that even though these are the three factors that have magnified the human impact on Earth, there's an uneven spread of all three of those over the world. However, the economic growth came to appear possible and desirable almost everywhere. Again, we were talking about this a little bit last chapter, that there's an optimism that your economic station in life, whether individually or as a country, does not have to maintain status quo. That your country does not always need to be poor. You do not need to always be poor. There is hope in a lot of cases. However, the human environmental disruptions are now of global proportions. For example, with a doubling of cropland and corresponding contraction of forest and grasslands, because let's face it, if we have more people, one of the more problems we have is we have to feed those more people. So we need more land upon which to farm, to grow more food, to feed those more people. So those forest and grasslands need to go and they need to be turned into cropland. There's also related to this, as well as a lot of other elements, an enormous extinction of plant and animal species. Air pollution in many cities and rivers are unprecedented levels. And of course, the chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs, are going to thin out the ozone layer. So this isn't necessarily, just simply local issues. These are truly and completely global issues as well. So, environmentalism began in the 19th century as a response to the Industrial Revolution. Remember, the Industrial Revolution was amazingly harsh on the general environment. I mean, it was done with a complete and total disregard for its long-term consequences. But environmentalism doesn't become a global phenomenon until the second half of the 20th century. And it begins with a book written by Rachel Carson known as Silent Spring. Guys, you want to go ahead, you want to put a star there by A, please. The impetus for this action, for this new environmentalism, comes from grassroots movements and citizens' protests. It is going to be a bottom up movement rather than a top down uh, type of movement. And eventually, here in places such as in Germany, environmentalists are going to enter into politics as the Green Party. As time goes on, environmentalism is going to take root in developing countries in the 70s and the 80s. However, this is going to be a little bit different than environmentalism in the Western world. Here, it tended to be more locally based. involving poorer people. So you want to, one, because it's a big difference, you want to put a star there by A, underneath number three. And then you also want to write down here, also next to A under three, you also want to put down it's also related to cultural revival. It's also related to cultural revival. You have again, this is very much tied to the aftermath of decolonization, where people are trying to rekindle and to protect their way of life, especially their way of life before the Europeans showed up, to preserve their culture, their society, and also for their environment as well. However, another difference is going to be, and how it's also going to be more locally based, it's going to be more concerned with food security, health, and survival. It's going to be more focused on saving threatened people rather than plants and animals. And environmentalists here are going to sometimes seek basic changes in the political structure of their country in order to preserve this food security, in order to protect these number of oftentimes indigenous minorities from these overwhelmingly big business, like for example in the Philippines, going up against these foreign mining companies. Eventually, here, environmentalism is going to become a matter of global concern by the end of the 20th century. We have legislation to control population in many countries. There's the encouragement of businesses to become green. And where this encouragement comes from, and you want to put down here next to B underneath number four, you want to put down tax incentives. You want to put down tax incentives in most of the industrial world, in the UK, I know, for example, if you put solar on your house, you get an absolutely massive check from the UK government for that green initiative that you're taking. And there's also the same thing in the United States with businesses. So you can kind of write off the cost of that financial undertaking to make your business, to make your home more green. There's also going to be a lot of research, and oftentimes governmentally funded research, on alternative energy sources as well. And again, just like with feminism and with a lot of these kind of like big picture things, there's going to be sharp conflicts between the global north and the global south, i.e., between the developed world and the developing world, where the northern efforts to control pollution and global warming could limit the south's industrial development. And in fact, these developing countries perceive the developed ones as unwilling to give up their extravagance and really help matters. So there's this big throwback, there's this big back and forth where the developing world is like, okay, hold on a second. While the developed world was developing with the Industrial Revolution, they really didn't give a damn about the environmental consequences of what they were doing industrially. And now to the global south, for them, it just feels as though the global north, the developed world, is hamstringing them by saying, okay, we want you to be able to do exactly what we're able to do. But by the way, you have to do it without the same advantages and without the same, throw it away to the environment type of attitude. And on top of that, the global south is looking at the global north, at the developing world, going and saying, look, you guys are telling us to make sacrifices, but at the end of the day, you're not really kind of stepping up and making the sacrifices you need to make in order to truly bring any type of environmental change. So there's a little bit of, a back and forth going on between the developed world and the developing world. So, for the very, very, very last thing that we're going to do, and the very last big picture thing that we're going to do, is just sort of kind of like reflecting back on everything and pondering the past. Because history gives an opportunity to explore matters which definite answers are elusive and questions are at least sometimes as important as conclusions. There's a lot of gray area within history that there isn't necessarily, especially very recent modern history, there's not a lot of answers to, because oftentimes the history is still evolving. And sometimes the true fallout of the true consequences or benefits of that history have yet to be seen. Or the outcomes, even the definite answers that are there, can be contested. Like they can be reinterpreted. In terms of suffering and compassion, we see if we look over the entire span of history that it is a common part of human experience. That suffering is derived in many cases from our own actions. We do it to ourselves. And this knowledge can also shape our behavior in the future that we need to learn, like that punching ourselves in the face is going to hurt. So we need to do things that will not cause us to punch ourselves in the face. Hope is another issue that's worth exploring. In fact, oftentimes this concept is overlooked. So you want to go ahead and put a star there by number two. Um, the big thing here with hope is that we have proven to be resilient in the past. Hard times come and problems come. However, we are able to get through those. We're able to, with resolve, persevere and come out the other end different, but, hopefully better, or at least better for knowing through that experience. We also here are capable of doing good, like abolitionism, women's vote, addressing the inequalities of capitalism, overcoming repressive communist regimes. I mean, again, you know, we're not necessarily great, big, huge, massive jerks. Our response to otherness is another topic of exploration. Because here's the issue, and this is especially the case, I think, oftentimes for us specifically, is most people are inclined to be insular. You want to put a little star here by A, and then you want to put down here next to A underneath number three that this exploration promotes diversity. This exploration promotes diversity. Because at the end of the day, all have limited experiences with other cultures. Some are going to be more limited than others. And history provides an opportunity to understand other people through time and also in places that we cannot logistically travel. It allows us to get an understanding and to limit that insulative quality that we have, that kind of very, it's all about me notion that a lot of us have from time to time. It allows us to see that we're part of a larger group. And more importantly, and we're going to have to star this and also have a note underneath this, history can provide context and perspective on our own limited experience. You want to go ahead and put a star there by D. And then underneath, and this is kind of like the big thing here I want to leave you with. So you want to put this down underneath D. Do you want to put, please, here that history shows the good, bad, and differences of humankind. And it also shows our basic similarities and honors our uniqueness.